He was disgusted by his albino daughter. He sold her to an Apache, who received a goddess. The cruelty of a father's rejection would transform into an unexpected destiny. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to the channel and comment where you're watching from. Joan Silva's existence had always been measured in shadows and silence. The whispers followed her through the dusty streets of Barra Seca, a forgotten town where superstition ran as deep as the drought-cracked soil. Her alabaster skin and silver-white hair marked her as different, a living ghost who moved through life untouched and unwanted. The locals crossed themselves when she passed, their mumbled prayers trailing behind her like dust. At 18, she remained a stranger even within the walls of her own home. Her father, Silas Silva, could barely look at her without his face twisting in disgust. To him, she was not a daughter, but a reminder, a cruel joke played by fate when his beloved wife died bringing this cursed child into the world. The small farmhouse that should have been a sanctuary was instead a prison of bitter silence, broken only by harsh commands or drunken curses. "Fetch the water," he would bark, or "clean the floor," never using her name, as if speaking it might summon bad fortune. Joan had learned to move silently, to make herself invisible, her bare feet soundless on the worn wooden floors. She had become expert at reading the slope of her father's shoulders, the tightness around his mouth, signs that warned of coming storms of rage. Last night, she had pressed her ear against the thin wooden wall separating her sparse bedroom from the main room. Through the cracks, lamplight flickered as male voices murmured in negotiation. Her father's voice, slurred with cachaça, haggled over what she first thought were livestock prices. 2 mules, then. Good strong ones, Silas had insisted. And the provisions I mentioned. Plus gold. I want at least 1 coin for my trouble all these years. The stranger's voice was measured, businesslike. The cacique has heard of the White Moon Woman. He believes she is sacred. I can offer what you ask. Only then did Joan understand. She was the commodity being traded. Her pale hands trembled as she slid down the wall to the floor, a cold certainty settling in her stomach. Her father was selling her, his own daughter, for 2 mules, a crate of canned food, and a single gold coin. The price of banishing what he considered a curse from his life forever. In the darkness of her room, Joan wrapped her arms around herself, feeling the rapid beat of her heart. By morning, she would be gone from the only home she had ever known, delivered into the hands of strangers who saw her not as human, but as something else entirely. The only warmth in Joan Silva's life came from a fading memory that she clutched like a precious stone. Her mother's gentle song, a lullaby about moonlight and protection that had once filled their small home. In those rare, quiet moments when the day's work was done, Joan would close her eyes and summon her mother's voice, sweet and clear, despite the 5 years that had passed since her death during a harsh winter fever. Even this comfort was poisoned by the shadow of her father's bitterness. Silas had once been a different man, stern but fair, with occasional smiles that crinkled the corners of his eyes. That man had died alongside his wife, replaced by a hollow shell filled only with grief and resentment. His pain had twisted into a venomous hatred for the daughter who reminded him too much of what he'd lost. Her unusual appearance a constant reminder of his wife's fascination with old stories about moon-blessed children. "Your mother's superstitions killed her," he would mutter after too much cachaça, glaring at Joan's pale hands as she prepared their meager dinner. "Calling you blessed when you're nothing but a curse." Now, after years of enduring his coldness, her father's solution was final and brutal. Joan pressed her ear against the thin wooden wall of their home, listening as Silas bartered away her existence like unwanted livestock. "The girl is healthy enough," her father said to Elias Costa, the traveling merchant who visited Barra Seca twice yearly. Strong back, knows how to work. Strange looking, but that's why the savage wants her, isn't it? Joan held her breath as Elias, a man of few words, but shrewd business sense, named his price. 2 mules, to replace the one Silas had lost in the spring floods. A crate of canned food to last through the coming dry season, and a single gold coin, an afterthought, tossed in to seal the transaction. "She'll leave with me tomorrow," Elias stated flatly. "The Tupiniquim in Serra Verde are expecting her. Their chief has heard stories of the pale girl. He's willing to pay well." Joan sank to the floor, wrapping her arms around herself as the men finalized the details of her journey. Serra Verde was a remote mountain region where indigenous people lived far from the dusty poverty of Barra Seca. In her father's drunken rants, they were savages and heathens. Now she was being sent to them, sold like a curiosity, a human oddity for their amusement or worse. She didn't cry. Tears had dried up long ago in the parched landscape of her existence. Instead, she began to pack the few possessions she could call her own, preparing for exile to a world completely unknown. The morning of Joan's exile arrived with the cruelest of ironies, blazing sunlight that made her pale skin ache, forcing her to shield her silver-white hair beneath a thin cloth. Silas Silva stood in the doorway of their modest home, his weathered face carved with lines of bitterness and the cold satisfaction of finally ridding himself of his burden. "A savage is a fitting mate for a creature like you," he spat, shoving her roughly across the threshold. Joan stumbled but didn't fall, clutching her small bundle of possessions, a spare dress, her mother's wooden comb, and a tattered book of poetry hidden beneath the fabric. She refused to give him the satisfaction of seeing her tears. 18 years of his contempt had taught her to swallow grief like bitter medicine. The neighbors watched from their windows and doorways, their faces a mixture of pity and relief. None stepped forward to protest the sale of a daughter. Elias Costa waited by his cart, already loaded with trade goods bound for distant villages. As the cart lurched forward, Joan didn't look back at the only home she'd ever known. The small cluster of buildings that made up Barra Seca grew smaller behind them, the world of shadowed rooms and bitter words fading with each turn of the wheels. The Brazilian hinterland stretched before them, vast and indifferent. The sun beat down mercilessly, and Joan felt exposed beneath its glare. In her father's house, she had learned to live in corners and shadows, to make herself small and invisible. Here, under the endless sky, there was nowhere to hide. Elias offered her water from a canteen, but little conversation. The cart bumped and rattled along the rutted trail. Joan watched the landscape change around them, scrubland giving way to drier terrain, then back to patches of stubborn vegetation. By midday, the familiar landmarks of her childhood had completely disappeared. Joan Silva was now truly alone, bound for a place she couldn't imagine, to be given to a man whose language she didn't speak. Her fingers traced the outline of her hidden book through the fabric of her bundle, clinging to this one small piece of herself that couldn't be bartered away. Every mile of the dusty road carried Joan Silva further from the only life she had known. The wooden cart creaked beneath her, each jolt a reminder of her new reality. Though the physical distance from her father grew, his venomous stories about the wild savages of the interior echoed in her mind, feeding her mounting dread. Elias Costa maintained a businesslike demeanor throughout their journey. He offered her water from a leather canteen when the sun climbed high, and shared dried meat and fruit at mealtimes. But his eyes remained fixed on the path ahead. To him, she was cargo, a transaction to be completed, nothing more. "You'll need to drink more in this heat," the merchant said once, his voice neither cruel nor kind. "Your skin burns easier than most." Joan sipped obediently, watching the Brazilian hinterland unfold around them, an endless expanse of scrubland and distant mountains that seemed to mock her insignificance. The silence between them stretched like the horizon, broken only by the rhythmic plodding of the mules and occasional directions Elias muttered to the animals. When darkness fell, the wilderness revealed a different kind of loneliness. They made camp beneath a sky ablaze with stars, their fire a tiny island of light in the vast emptiness. Joan wrapped herself in the thin blanket Elias had provided, feeling smaller than she ever had in her father's shadow. The night pressed in around her, both terrifying and strangely liberating. On their third evening, as Joan stared into the flames, Elias finally spoke of what awaited her. "The man you're to marry is called Paulo," he said, poking at the fire. "He's the cacique, the chief of the Tupiniquim people, a respected man." Joan's fingers tightened around her blanket. "Why would he want someone like me?" Elias glanced at her silver hair gleaming in the firelight. "His wife died 2 years ago. They say he mourned so deeply the village feared for him." He paused, measuring his words. He heard stories of the pale woman with moon-colored hair from traders who passed through Barra Seca. "My father called me cursed," Joan whispered. "Paulo doesn't see it that way." Elias looked up at the star-filled sky. "The Tupiniquim have different beliefs. They say people marked by nature carry powerful spirits." He shrugged, returning to his practical self. "We'll reach their territory tomorrow. The mountains ahead are their home." Joan lay awake long after Elias began to snore, watching the unfamiliar constellations wheel overhead. Tomorrow she would meet this widowed chief who had purchased her sight unseen. Tomorrow she would discover if she'd been delivered from one prison into another. Joan Silva huddled against the wooden side of the cart, her silver hair catching the last light of day, as confusion battled with the terror that had been her constant companion. The journey had stretched for days across the harsh Brazilian landscape, each mile taking her further from the only life she'd known, miserable as it had been. "You're trembling," Elias Costa observed, his weathered face revealing neither cruelty nor kindness. "The Tupiniquim aren't the savages your father described." She clutched her thin shawl tighter. "Then why would he sell me to them?" The merchant adjusted the reins, his eyes fixed on the dusty path ahead. "Your father sees only what serves his bitterness. The tribal people of Serra Verde have their own beliefs, their own wisdom." Joan's pale fingers twisted in her lap. The monsters from her father's hateful stories, wild men who would enslave or devour her, were being given names, histories, humanity. It didn't align with the terror Silas had planted in her heart. "This Paulo," she whispered, "why would he want someone like me?" Elias slowed the cart as they approached a stream. "The cacique is respected among his people, a widower who lost his wife 2 seasons ago." He paused, seeming to measure his words. "Word travels, even to remote villages." Stories of the pale girl with hair like moonlight reached Serra Verde. Her breath caught. "He asked for me specifically? He sent me with trade goods to find the white moon woman of Barra Seca." Elias's voice softened unexpectedly. "Where you come from, they see a curse. Paulo believes he's being sent a goddess." The words struck Joan with visible force. A goddess? The very idea was so foreign, so contrary to everything she'd been told about herself, that she couldn't absorb it. In Barra Seca, her appearance had been a mark of shame, a constant reminder of her mother's death in childbirth. Her father had called her cursed, unnatural, a blight. "That's impossible," she whispered. "Many things are possible beyond the world you've known," Elias replied. "The Tupiniquim see meaning in what others fear." As the cart rumbled forward, Joan felt something unfamiliar stir within her. Not quite hope, but perhaps its distant cousin. The shame that had been carved into her soul since childhood trembled slightly, as if a crack had formed in its foundation. She looked toward the mountains rising ahead, their peaks disappearing into clouds. Somewhere in those heights waited a man who had requested her by name, not to punish or exploit, but because he saw something sacred where others had seen only stain. The possibility was terrifying. It was beautiful. It was entirely unknown. The journey upward transformed the landscape around them. As Elias Costa's cart climbed the winding paths into the mountains, Joan felt the air change, becoming cooler, sweeter, filled with scents she had never known. The barren plains of her childhood, with their relentless sun and dust, gave way to verdant slopes dotted with wildflowers and towering pines. Each turn revealed more of the valley below, a hidden paradise nestled between protective ridges. The Tupiniquim have lived here for generations, Elias explained, his usual taciturn manner softening slightly. They chose this place for its protection and abundance. Joan leaned forward, taking in the vista. The valley spread beneath them like a green jewel, nothing like the harsh, unforgiving land of Barra Seca. Wisps of smoke rose from what must be cooking fires, and she could make out the shapes of dwellings arranged in a circular pattern. This secret world seemed to breathe with life, vibrant, lush, and somehow welcoming despite her fears. The scent of pine mingled with wood smoke as they descended into the valley. Joan's hands trembled in her lap. All her life, she had heard her father speak of the indigenous people as savages, as something less than human. His bitter words had painted them as creatures to be feared. Now she was to become one of them. As their vehicle entered the village, conversations stilled. Children paused in their play, women looked up from their work, and men stepped forward from their tasks. Every eye turned toward the pale woman with silver hair. Joan instinctively shrank back against the wooden seat, anticipating the disgust and rejection she had known her entire life. But the faces that surrounded her showed something entirely different. There was curiosity in their gazes, even wonder. No one spat or made signs against evil as the people in Barra Seca had done. Instead, a small child darted forward, offering a tiny wildflower before being gently pulled back by his mother. An elderly woman approached, her face lined with years, but her eyes bright with intelligence. She studied Joan without judgment, then nodded, as if confirming something to herself. This was not the hostile place Silas Silva had described in his drunken rants. The community that surrounded her now seemed rich with connection. Children played freely, elders sat in respected positions, and the air itself felt different. Where her father's home had been steeped in bitterness and isolation, this place hummed with shared purpose and warmth. For the first time since leaving Barra Seca, Joan felt something unexpected unfurl in her chest. Not just fear, but a fragile, tentative hope. The wooden cart creaked to a halt in the center of the Tupiniquim village, dust settling around the wheels as curious eyes gathered. Joan Silva sat frozen, her pale hands clutching the rough fabric of her dress. The journey had left her exhausted, but fear kept her alert as villagers emerged from their homes, forming a circle around the newcomers. Elias Costa gestured toward the gathering crowd. "They've been expecting you," he said, his voice neither kind nor cruel. It was the voice of a man completing a transaction. The crowd parted like water around a stone as a tall figure approached. Paulo moved with the quiet confidence of a man who commanded respect without demanding it. His broad shoulders and straight posture marked him as the leader, but it was his eyes that captured Joan's attention, deep and thoughtful, bearing the weight of both authority and personal loss. The villagers fell silent, not cowering as Joan had expected, but with a reverence that spoke of genuine admiration. Paulo's face was weathered by sun and time, lines etched around his eyes suggesting both laughter and sorrow. His black hair, streaked with silver at the temples, was tied back simply. When Paulo finally stood before the cart, Joan instinctively shrank back. Every lesson from her father had taught her that her appearance invited disgust. She braced herself for the familiar curl of a lip, the narrowing of eyes that had followed her throughout her life in Barra Seca. Instead, Paolo's expression transformed. His eyes widened with something Joan had never witnessed directed at her. Wonder. Pure, unguarded wonder. He looked at her not as a curiosity or an abomination, but as something precious and rare. Lua branca, he said softly in Portuguese, his voice deep and warm. White moon. The name hung in the air between them, and Joan felt something shift inside her chest. This was not a slur or an accusation. It was spoken with the gentle reverence one might use for something sacred. Paolo extended his hand, palm up, not demanding, but offering. You have traveled far, he continued in careful Portuguese. The spirits have guided you to us. Joan didn't move, couldn't move. The chief's gaze held no trace of the revulsion she had come to expect. Instead, he looked at her as if she were a blessing that had fallen unexpectedly from the sky. For the first time in her life, Joan's difference wasn't a curse to be hidden or endured. In Paolo's eyes, her pale skin and silver hair were marks of something extraordinary, something to be honored rather than shunned. Paolo guided Joan Silva to a modest dwelling nestled beneath the sprawling branches of an ancient tree. This is yours, he said, his voice gentle but firm. This simple declaration stunned her. Never before had she possessed anything of her own, let alone a home. The lodge stood apart from the other dwellings, offering privacy while remaining part of the village. As Joan stepped inside, she noticed the careful preparation. Soft animal furs covered portions of the earthen floor. A clay jug filled with clear water sat on a small wooden table, and a hand-woven blanket was folded with precision at the foot of a simple sleeping mat. The cacique remained at the threshold, respecting her space. Rest, he said, gesturing to the interior. When you are ready, the village waits. With that, Paolo departed, leaving Joan alone with her thoughts. She moved cautiously through the small space, touching the walls as if they might dissolve. The home was humble yet possessed an undeniable dignity, much like the people of this place. A small fire pit occupied the center, with dried herbs hanging from the rafters above. The scent reminded her of her mother's remedies, a memory both painful and comforting. That first night, Joan curled beneath the blanket, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of the forest. The darkness felt different here, alive rather than oppressive. Sleep came in fitful bursts, her dreams filled with the journey that had brought her to this strange new world. Morning arrived with golden light filtering through the doorway. Joan remained inside, watching through the opening as the village awakened. Children raced past, their laughter a foreign sound to her ears. Women gathered at the communal cooking area, their movements efficient and purposeful. Men departed with hunting tools, returning later with game and fish. For 3 days, she observed this rhythm from her doorway, a silent witness to a life so different from the isolation she had known in Barra Seca. No one intruded upon her solitude, yet small offerings appeared. A bowl of stew, a handful of berries, a carved wooden comb. On the third evening, as shadows lengthened across the village, Joan ventured to sit just outside her doorway. The simple act felt monumental. From this vantage point, she could see Helena teaching young Mateus to weave a small basket, their heads bent together in concentration. For the first time since arriving, Joan allowed herself to wonder, what if this kindness was real? What if, in this place where she had been sent as payment, she might find what had always been denied her? The thought was both terrifying and exhilarating, like standing at the edge of an unseen precipice. From her doorway, Joan Silva observed the rhythmic dance of village life unfolding before her. Women gathered in small circles, their nimble fingers weaving intricate baskets from reeds collected at the riverbank. Their laughter floated through the air like music, genuine and unrestrained, so unlike the tense silence that had filled her father's home. Some worked with clay pots near communal fires, others ground corn between smooth stones, all moving with practiced efficiency that spoke of generations of shared knowledge. The children of the Tupiniquim were less subtle in their curiosity. They darted glances at her whenever they passed, their dark eyes wide with wonder, rather than the fear or disgust she had grown accustomed to in Barra Seca. One small girl, no more than 5 years old, even waved shyly before being pulled along by her mother. Joan found herself lifting her hand in response, the simple gesture feeling foreign yet comforting. Paulo maintained his respectful distance, but his watchful presence was constant. The cacique would appear periodically throughout the day, sometimes speaking with elders beneath the shade of a massive tree, other times instructing young men in hunting techniques. Though he never approached directly, his gaze would find her, a gentle acknowledgement that she was seen and protected. This attention carried no demands, no expectations, only patient care that allowed her the space to acclimate at her own pace. On the third morning after her arrival, Joan woke to find a small surprise waiting at her threshold. A delicate bouquet of wildflowers, purple, yellow, and white blossoms tied with a simple grass cord, rested against her doorframe. She recognized these flowers immediately. They were the same ones she had paused to admire the previous afternoon, growing stubbornly between rocks at the village's edge. Her fingers trembled slightly as she lifted the gift. Someone had noticed that brief moment, had seen how she'd knelt to touch the petals with wonder. In Barra Seca, her preferences had been ignored or mocked by Silas, her existence itself a burden. Yet here, a stranger had observed something as insignificant as her admiration for wildflowers and had thought it worthy of acknowledgement. Joan brought the bouquet inside her lodge, searching for something to hold the stems. Finding a small clay cup, she filled it with water and arranged the flowers carefully. Their fragrance filled her modest home, subtle yet persistent. Like hope itself, she thought, fragile but surprisingly resilient when given the slightest chance to flourish. She placed the makeshift vase near her sleeping mat, a colorful reminder that in this place, perhaps she might eventually become more than just a ghost to be tolerated. Perhaps here, she might finally be seen. The morning sun filtered through the leaves as Joan sat at the threshold of her lodge, watching the village life unfold. The distance between her and the community had begun to shrink, like ice melting at the edges of a frozen pond. A shadow fell across the packed earth before her doorway. Joan looked up to find a woman standing there, her posture gentle but assured. In her hands she carried a clay bowl filled with steaming corn stew, the aroma rich and inviting. "Helena," the woman said softly, touching her chest before extending the bowl. Then she pointed to Joan with a respectful nod. "Joan Lua Branca." Joan accepted the offering with trembling hands. Helena, Paulo's sister-in-law, smiled and settled beside her, not too close, respecting the invisible boundary Joan had drawn around herself. They ate in companionable silence, the only sounds the distant laughter of children and the soft clacking of looms where other women worked. The next day, Helena returned, this time with a small boy clinging to her skirts. Mateus peered at Joan with unabashed curiosity, his dark eyes wide as he studied her silver hair and pale skin. Instead of the judgment Joan had grown accustomed to in Barra Seca, the child's gaze held only wonder. Their visits became a ritual. Helena would arrive sometimes with food, sometimes with nothing but her presence. She would sit near Joan, weaving baskets or mending clothes, occasionally offering a Portuguese word and waiting for Joan to provide the Tupiniquim equivalent. Their vocabulary grew together, bridging worlds with each new word. Mateus gradually ventured closer each day, eventually settling at Joan's feet to play with smooth river stones, while the women shared their silent communion. The boy's acceptance was pure, untainted by prejudice or fear. On the 7th day, when Helena rose to leave, Joan surprised herself by reaching out to touch the woman's wrist. "Tomorrow?" she asked, her voice rusty from disuse. Helena's smile bloomed like the wildflowers that dotted the valley. "Tomorrow," she confirmed with a nod. That night, Joan lay awake on her sleeping mat, feeling something unfamiliar stirring in her chest. The sensation was fragile, tentative, like a bird testing damaged wings. It took her some time to recognize it as hope. For the first time since arriving in the village, Joan allowed herself to imagine belonging here, not as cargo delivered and tolerated, but as a person with value. The thought was terrifying in its vulnerability, yet she couldn't push it away. When morning came, Joan found herself watching the path that led to her door, waiting for Helena and Mateus with an eagerness that felt like coming alive. For 3 nights, Joan had listened to young Mateus's cough echo through the village. The harsh barking sound stirred memories she'd buried deep. Her mother bent over a steaming pot, crushing leaves between practiced fingers, whispering remedies passed down through generations. Before illness took her, Joan's mother had been known for her healing hands, a gift she'd tried to pass to her daughter in hushed lessons away from Silas Silva's disapproving gaze. The 4th morning, as Helena visited with Mateus clinging to her side, the boy's face flushed with fever, Joan made a decision. "I might be able to help him," she whispered, the words feeling foreign on her tongue. Helena's eyes widened with hope. "You know medicine?" Joan nodded hesitantly. "My mother taught me, before." When Helena and her son left, Joan ventured beyond the safety of her lodge for the first time without escort. She followed the narrow path to the river, scanning the banks for the familiar fuzzy leaves of mullein. Her heart raced with each step, not just from fear of judgment, but from the terrifying possibility of failure. What if her memories were wrong? What if the remedy harmed rather than healed? Near a sun-dappled bend in the river, she spotted them. Tall stalks crowned with yellow flowers, their leaves soft as lamb's ears. Joan gathered them reverently, remembering her mother's instructions. "The leaves hold the medicine, daughter. The spirits live in the green." Back in her lodge, she crushed the leaves between 2 smooth stones, working them into a paste. She added a spoonful of animal fat from her cooking supplies, mixing until it formed a smooth balm. The familiar scent transported her across years and miles, momentarily connecting her to the mother she'd lost. That evening, Joan approached Helena's home, the small clay pot of salve clutched in trembling hands. "For Mateus," she explained, demonstrating how to rub it on his chest and back, and steam, boil water, and let him breathe the vapor with the leaves. Helena accepted the offering with solemn gratitude, though Joan could see the flicker of uncertainty in her eyes. Would this pale stranger's medicine be trusted? Joan returned to her lodge, sleep evading her as she listened for the boy's cough through the night. Dawn brought Helena to her doorway, Mateus beside her, breathing clear and easy for the first time in days. The woman's eyes shimmered with tears as she pressed her forehead to Joan's in a gesture of profound thanks. "You have healing hands, Lua Branca," Helena whispered. Word spread through the Tupiniquin village like ripples in still water. The White Moon Woman didn't just bring beauty with her silver hair and pale skin. She carried medicine in her hands. That night, Paolo left a bundle of dried herbs at her doorstep, an acknowledgement of her gift and an invitation to share it. The women of the Tupiniquin village began approaching Joan Silva with curious offerings: roots pulled from the forest floor, leaves with jagged edges, berries of vibrant colors. At first, they came hesitantly, watching from a distance as she examined each specimen. Her knowledge, inherited from her mother's whispered lessons years ago, slowly returned. She recognized the bitter bark that eased fevers, the sticky sap that sealed wounds, the fragrant leaves that calmed restless minds. "This helps the chest," she explained to an elderly woman who brought her a handful of star-shaped flowers. The language barrier crumbled word by word as Joan pointed, demonstrated, and smiled. Outside her lodge, she began transforming the bare earth. Her pale fingers, once hidden in shame, now dug purposefully into the rich soil. She transplanted wildflowers that had caught her eye, purple blooms that clung to rocky outcroppings, delicate white blossoms that danced in the breeze. Between them, she planted rows of healing herbs, arranging them in careful patterns that would make harvesting easier. The garden became her sanctuary and her offering to the community that had welcomed her. Children would stop to watch her work, their eyes wide with fascination at the silver-haired woman who could make things grow. Some of the bolder ones would help her water the plants, giggling when she praised their efforts in her improving tupaniquim. Paulo no longer left wildflowers at her doorstep. Instead, he brought something more precious: his time. In the cool evenings, after his duties as cacique were fulfilled, he would sit with her near the garden. Their lessons began formally, he teaching her the rhythms and meanings of his people's language, she helping him refine his Portuguese. "This word means healing," he would say, taking her hand and guiding it to a plant she had cultivated. "And in Portuguese, we say cura," she would respond, her voice growing stronger with each exchange. Their conversations deepened beyond simple translations. He shared stories of his people's history, of his childhood climbing the tallest trees in the valley. She cautiously offered memories of her mother's kindness, the only warmth in her previous life. With each story exchanged, the distance between them narrowed. The village noticed the transformation. The woman they had first seen as a curiosity, trembling and pale as moonlight, now moved among them with growing confidence. Helena would often join their lessons, bringing Matthias, whose health flourished under Joan's care. Other villagers began to linger, adding words, sharing laughter. What had begun as a transaction, a woman sold for 2 mules and supplies, had evolved into something neither Joan nor Paulo could have imagined. A bridge between worlds, built word by word, plant by plant, day by day. Though Joan Silva had found acceptance among the Tupiniquin people, a delicate boundary remained between her and Paulo. She had become familiar with his presence in the village, his commanding yet gentle leadership, the respect that followed him, the way children quieted their games to listen when he spoke. Yet they rarely spent time alone together, their interactions limited to language lessons and brief exchanges. As the sun began its descent one evening, casting long shadows across the village, Paulo approached her lodge. Joan looked up from the herbs she was sorting, surprised to see the cacique standing in her doorway. "Would you walk with me?" he asked, his Portuguese careful and measured. "The river is peaceful at this hour." Joan nodded, setting aside her work. They walked in comfortable silence through the village, past cooking fires and curious glances. The path led them down through the valley, winding between ancient trees whose branches filtered the fading light. The sounds of the village faded behind them, replaced by the gentle murmur of flowing water. Paulo led her to a secluded cove where the river pooled in tranquil eddies before continuing its journey. Overhead, the first stars pierced the darkening sky. "Your garden grows well," Paulo said finally, gesturing back toward the village. "The elders say they have never seen mullein flourish so quickly here." "The soil is good," Joan replied softly. "It is not just the soil." His eyes met hers. "You are like those flowers you tend, blooming where others would wither. I have watched you transform this place with your presence." The unexpected praise warmed her cheeks. No one had ever spoken of her as something beautiful before. Paulo sat on a smooth boulder by the water's edge, inviting her to join him. "Before you came, there was emptiness here," he continued, his voice low. "When my wife died, the light went with her. I thought my heart would remain barren forever." Joan listened, sensing the weight of his confession. Then Elias Costa told stories of the White Moon Woman in Barraseca, a healer with silver hair who was treated as a curse. Paulo's gaze was steady, unafraid. "I knew then that sometimes the spirits send us what we need, not what we expect." The vulnerability in his words touched something deep within Joan. Here was a man who had also known loss, yet chose hope instead of bitterness. "I was afraid to hope," she admitted. My father taught me that I was something to be ashamed of. Paulo nodded, understanding in his eyes. Fear and shame are heavy burdens to carry alone. In that moment beneath the emerging stars, Joan realized that Paulo saw her, truly saw her, not as a curse or a goddess, but as herself. The riverbank glowed silver under the half-moon as Joan Silva found herself speaking words she'd never shared with another soul. Her voice trembled at first, then steadied as she described the years of living as a ghost in her father's house. How Silas would turn away when she entered a room. How the servants whispered curse when they thought she couldn't hear. "He blamed me for my mother's death," she said, fingers tracing patterns in the sand. "Every time he looked at me, he saw only her absence and my strangeness." Paulo listened without interruption, his weathered face illuminated by moonlight. The cacique's eyes held no pity, only a deep, respectful attention that gave Joan the courage to continue. "I learned to make myself small," she confessed, "to breathe quietly, to walk without sound. I became what he wanted, nothing." When she finally fell silent, Paulo reached across the space between them. His hand covered hers, warm and steady against her cool skin. The touch was simple yet profound, the first time anyone had reached for her without hesitation or fear. "In my language," he said softly, "we have a saying, a man who complains about the full moon does not see the sky." His thumb traced a gentle circle on her wrist. "Your father's blindness is not yours to bear, Lua Branca." The words washed over Joan like the river current, eroding years of accumulated shame. She looked up at the vast Brazilian sky, stars scattered like the wildflowers she'd begun to cultivate outside her lodge. For the first time, she saw herself through Paulo's eyes, not as a flaw to be hidden, but as something rare and valuable. "I was sold to you," she whispered, the truth of it still raw. "Yes," Paulo acknowledged, his voice deep and certain. "But you were never bought. My people do not own people. The payment was for the journey, not for you." He gestured toward the distant mountains. "The stories of the White Moon Woman reached us through traders. I sent Elias with gifts, hoping you might choose to come." The revelation struck Joan like lightning. What she'd understood as a transaction had been an invitation. The chief had never seen her as property, but as a person with choice. They walked back to the village in silence, but it was a different kind of quiet. Not the emptiness of isolation, but the fullness of understanding. Their shoulders brushed occasionally, each touch a small acknowledgement of something new growing between them. That night, alone in her lodge, Joan felt her heart racing with something terrifying and beautiful. The feeling had no name in her experience, but as she drifted to sleep, she recognized it at last. Love. In the weeks that followed, Joan found herself woven into the rhythms of village life. Each morning, she tended her growing garden of medicinal herbs, carefully transplanting wildflowers that reminded her of her mother's teachings. The pale hands once hidden in shame now moved with purpose and confidence. Paulo invited her to learn horseback riding, a skill valued among the Tupiniquim. Their first lesson began with Joan trembling before the large chestnut mare, but Paulo's patient guidance transformed her fear into exhilaration. Soon they were riding together through flowering meadows, her silver hair streaming behind her like a banner catching the sunlight. "You ride as if born to it," Paulo remarked one afternoon as they rested beneath a sprawling oak. But Cacique's eyes held admiration rather than the judgment she had known all her life. In the evenings, Joan shared fragments of her past, stories from the few precious books she had hidden beneath floorboards in her father's house. Paulo listened intently as she recounted tales of distant lands and brave hearts, his expression softening in the firelight. Helena noticed the change in both of them. "My brother sees the stars again when he looks at you," she confided while they prepared cornmeal together. "After my sister passed, we feared his heart had gone with her." The villagers began to seek Joan not only for healing, but for her company. Children who once hid behind their mothers now brought her colorful stones and feathers, treasures offered with shy smiles. Elders invited her to their circles, valuing her different perspective. Her pale thread strengthened the community's tapestry, adding a unique luster to their shared life. One evening, as the full moon bathed the village in silver light, Paolo asked Joan to walk with him to the river. The water reflected the moon perfectly, creating twin celestial bodies, one above, one below. "When I first heard of the White Moon Woman in Baraseca," Paolo said softly, "I felt a calling I could not explain." He reached into a small leather pouch at his waist and withdrew a necklace of polished river stones and juniper beads, each one carefully selected and strung with evident care. "This was made by my hands, for you alone," he said, his voice steady yet vulnerable. "When you came here, you were a seed planted in hope. Now you are the heart that beats beside mine." Paolo's eyes held hers with unwavering certainty. "Will you be my wife, Lua Branca?" The moonlight caught the simple necklace, transforming it into something more precious than gold. In that moment, Joan saw not just her present happiness, but a future filled with belonging. Tears streamed down Joan Silva's face, carving glistening paths along her cheeks. These weren't tears of sorrow or fear, emotions that had been her constant companions for 18 years, but of release and profound joy. The weight of her past seemed to lift from her shoulders as she stood before Paolo. "I was sold here," she said, her voice trembling yet underscored with newfound strength, "traded for mules and supplies like an unwanted possession." She paused, drawing a deep breath. "But now I choose freely. With all my heart, I choose you." Paolo reached for her hands, his touch gentle yet grounding. The cacique's eyes reflected the same wonder they had held when he first saw her, but now deepened with understanding and love. Around them, the village hummed with preparation and anticipation. The wedding day arrived with perfect clarity, the sky a brilliant blue canvas above the Serra Verde. Helena arrived at Joan's lodge early, bringing a group of women who carried baskets of wildflowers and herbs. They surrounded the bride with laughter and stories, sharing wisdom about marriage and family that transcended any cultural divide. "Today, you become truly one of us," Helena said as she carefully wove delicate white blossoms into Joan's silver hair. The women dressed her in a simple garment adorned with intricate beadwork that had once belonged to Paolo's mother. Each bead represented a prayer, a hope for the union to come. As the sun began its descent, casting long golden fingers through the trees, the drums began. Their steady rhythm called the village to gather, pulsing like a collective heartbeat. Joan stepped from her lodge, no longer the frightened girl who had arrived as human cargo. She walked with purpose, her bare feet connecting with the earth that had become her home. The villagers formed a path leading to the central fire where Paolo waited. The flames cast dancing shadows across his face as he watched her approach. Elder Antonio stood beside him, ready to officiate the ceremony that would bind them together. When Joan reached Paolo, the elder wrapped their hands in a single woven blanket, a symbol that from this day forward, their lives would be intertwined. The ceremonial covering, crafted by the women of the tribe, told stories in its patterns of resilience, growth, and enduring love. "Two rivers joining to form one," Antonio announced in the language of the Tupiniquim, which Joan now understood. Two spirits choosing to walk as one. As the blanket encircled them, Joan felt the final pieces of her broken past mend themselves. Here, beneath the open sky, surrounded by people who saw her true worth, she was no longer defined by rejection. She was Lua Branca, beloved wife, healer, and member of a family forged not by blood, but by choice and love. For the first time in her life, Joan Silva knew true peace. her days in the Tupiniquim village flowed with purpose and belonging. Each sunrise bringing new joy rather than dread, the small lodge beneath the great tree had become a true home, filled with the gentle sounds of laughter and conversation. Paulo's steady presence anchored her to this new reality. His quiet, her pale hands, once hidden in shame, now moved confidently through daily tasks. She learned to weave baskets alongside Helena, her fingers growing nimble with practice. The villagers sought her healing skills, bringing their ailments and injuries to the woman they called Lua Branca. Even her voice, so long silenced by her father's contempt, found strength in songs and stories shared around evening fires. The garden outside her home flourished with medicinal herbs and wildflowers, a living testament to her transformation. Children who had once watched her with curiosity now gathered eagerly when she appeared, begging for remedies for minor scrapes or simply to touch her silver hair, which they believed held magical properties. "You have brought healing to more than just bodies," Paulo told her one evening, as they walked along the river path. "You have brought healing to our hearts." The shame that had once been etched into her soul had faded to a faint silver scar, visible only in rare moments of reflection. Those moments grew increasingly scarce as seasons changed and her place in the community deepened. But the tranquility shattered one crisp autumn morning. Mateus came running into the village center, his young face tight with fear. He had been playing near the mountain path when he spotted them, a group of soldiers making their way up the steep trail, led by a white guide. The elders gathered quickly, Paulo at their center, as the boy described what he had seen. The guide was an older man with a weathered face and bitter eyes, directing the soldiers with angry gestures toward the village. Joan felt the blood drain from her face as the description crystallized into a terrible certainty. "Silas," she whispered, the name falling like a stone from her lips. Paulo turned to her, understanding immediately. "Your father," he said, not a question, but a confirmation. Helena moved to Joan's side, taking her hand in silent support as murmurs spread through the gathering crowd. After all this time, after finding peace and purpose, Silas Silva had come to reclaim what he had once discarded. The man who had sold his daughter for 2 mules and supplies was now climbing the mountain to destroy the life she had built from his rejection. The news of Silas Silva's approach spread through the village like wildfire. Joan felt her heart constrict with a familiar fear, memories of her father's contempt threatening to drown the confidence she had built. But as she looked around at the faces of those who had become her family, something shifted within her. "I will not hide," she declared, her voice stronger than she had ever heard it. "I am not the frightened girl he left behind. I am your wife, and this is my home." Paulo stood beside her, his hand finding hers. "No one will take you from here against your will," he promised, his voice carrying the weight of his authority as cacique. The village prepared with purposeful calm. This was not a preparation for battle, but a demonstration of unity. The Tupiniquim warriors gathered, not with aggression, but with dignified resolve. They formed a protective semicircle with Paulo at the center and Joan by his side, her silver hair catching the sunlight. Helena positioned herself nearby with Mateus, her presence a reminder of all Joan had given to the community. The elder Antonio, whose rheumatism Joan had eased with her herbal remedies, stood with his walking stick, his aged face set with determination. When the soldiers appeared at the edge of the clearing, Joan recognized her father immediately. Silas looked smaller somehow, diminished by the journey or perhaps by his own bitterness. He rode at the front, directing the lieutenant with sharp gestures toward Joan. "That's her," Silas called out, his voice cracking with age and anger. "My daughter, stolen and held against her will." The lieutenant, a young man with wary eyes, surveyed the scene before him. The formation of warriors, standing without weapons but with unmistakable resolve, gave him pause. "She is my property," Silas continued, dismounting awkwardly. "Sold under false pretenses. I've come to reclaim what's mine." Joan stepped forward, feeling Paulo's reassuring presence behind her. The fear that had defined her childhood years seemed to evaporate in the mountain air. She met her father's gaze directly, for perhaps the first time in her life. "I am not your property." "Silas Silva," she said, using his full name deliberately, denying him the title of father. Her voice carried across the clearing, steady and clear. "You sold me for 2 mules and a crate of food. You cast me out, believing I was a curse." She gestured to the people around her. "But I have found a home and a family here. You have no power over me anymore." Silas's face contorted with rage, but something else flickered there too, uncertainty. For the first time, he was facing not the cowering girl he had dominated, but a woman standing in her power, surrounded by people who valued her. The morning sun cast long shadows across the village clearing, as Joan Silva stood before her father, her silver hair gleaming in the light, no longer cowering. She faced him with the quiet dignity she had found among the Tupiniquim. "I am not your property, Silas Silva," she said, her voice carrying across the tense silence. "You sold me for 2 mules and a crate of food. You cast me out, believing I was a curse. But I have found a home and a family here. You have no power over me." Silas's face contorted with rage. He turned to the lieutenant, gesturing wildly. "She's bewitched by these savages. She belongs at home, under proper care." Paulo stepped forward, his presence commanding respect even from the armed soldiers. He placed his hand gently on Joan's shoulder, a gesture that spoke volumes about their bond. "The woman you call daughter has become our healer," he said in careful Portuguese. "The woman you discarded as worthless has saved many lives." From the gathered villagers, Helena emerged with Mateus by her side. The boy, once frail and sickly, now stood strong and healthy. "My son would have died last winter," she explained to the lieutenant. "Lua Branca knew which herbs would heal his lungs when nothing else worked." Elder Antonio, his weathered face a map of wisdom, stepped forward with the help of his walking stick. "I could not see for many seasons," he said, pointing to his clear eyes. "Her medicines brought back my sight." One by one, villagers came forward. A mother whose fever had broken under Joan's care, a hunter whose infected wound had healed, children who had learned to identify healing plants from the pale woman with gentle hands. The lieutenant, a man named Rodriguez, with tired eyes that had seen too much conflict, looked from Silas to Joan and back again. He observed how the villagers positioned themselves protectively around her, how Paulo's hand remained steady on her shoulder. "The law gives me no authority here," Lieutenant Rodriguez finally stated, turning to Silas. "This woman is clearly not being held against her will. She has married into this community by choice." Silas's face drained of color. "She's my daughter, my blood." "Blood you were willing to sell," the lieutenant replied coldly. "The matter is closed." As the soldiers prepared to leave, Silas made one desperate lunge toward Joan, but Paulo stepped between them, his eyes flashing with warning. "Go home, Silas Silva," Joan said softly. "Find peace if you can." The defeated man was escorted away, his shoulders slumped, his authority broken forever. As the soldiers disappeared down the mountain path, Joan felt the last chains of her past finally fall away. She was free. With her father's shadow banished from the mountains, Joan Silva finally embraced the peace that had eluded her for so long. The confrontation had cleansed something within her, the last remnants of shame washed away like silt from the river stones. The village celebrated their victory not with boasts, but with quiet gratitude, a feast where every family brought something to share beneath the stars. As the seasons turned and winter's grip loosened on Serra Verde, Joan noticed changes within herself. The morning sickness came first, then the gentle swell beneath her fingers. When she told Paulo, his eyes filled with tears as he placed his hand over hers. "A new life," he whispered, "born of choice and love." The news spread through the Tupiniquim village like a warm breeze. Helena was the first to bring gifts: tiny woven sandals and a small blanket she had been crafting in secret, somehow knowing before Joan herself. The elder women shared wisdom and remedies for her changing body, while Mateus, now healthy and strong, appointed himself guardian of his future cousin. In the garden she had cultivated, Joan planted new herbs specifically for mothers and infants. Her hands, once symbols of her difference, now created life everywhere they touched, in the soil, in her healing lurk, and within her own body. The pale skin that had marked her as cursed in Barra Seca now glowed in the firelight as the villagers sought her blessing. One evening, as spring unfurled across the valley, Paulo found her by the river where they had first spoken of love. "Your father sold you for 2 mules and some food," he said quietly, never knowing he was giving away a treasure beyond price. Joan leaned against him, watching the water flow past. "What was meant to destroy me became my salvation," she replied. "Perhaps that is the greatest revenge, to find joy where others intended pain." The story of the White Moon Woman spread beyond the mountains. Travelers brought tales of the pale healer who married the cacique, whose hands brought life from barren soil. Some said she was a spirit made flesh. Others claimed she could speak to the ancestors. Joan simply smiled at these stories, knowing the truth was both simpler and more profound. Under the full moon of early summer, with Paulo's arms encircling her and her hands resting on her growing belly, Joan felt the child move within her, a flutter like butterfly wings. In that moment, surrounded by the night sounds of the forest and the distant voices of the village, she knew with absolute certainty that she was home. The daughter sold for mules had become a mother, a healer, a wife, and most importantly, herself at last.